Always.
I started to work on it. I was about 5 years old when I started to lose my sight.
From that moment, Ray Charles could no longer see the world, but the world began to truly notice him. The only thing is, no one truly saw what he concealed in the shadows. They only heard the singing. They didn't hear the silent cries. They only saw the brilliance. They didn't see the quiet fractures gnawing at a genius's soul. Ray departed with 10 dreadful secrets, more profound than any low note he ever played. Each secret was a deep gash into a seemingly flawless legacy. A father to 12 children who never quite found the courage to be a true father. A silent hero in the civil rights movement, yet once banished by his own home state as a traitor. And those are just two of the things no one has dared to delve into. And the remaining secrets are what might leave you breathless, not from shock, but from sorrow. The sorrow of a man who once stood above all, yet could not fully embrace his own life. Here, you will hear the music he never composed. But before we embark on this journey of peeling back each layer of the past, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the truths that will silence your heart.
Georgia, the whole day.
Nothing is more poignant than a love song sung sweetly by the world, while the very person who wrote it chokes back tears every time they hear it. Georgia on My Mind, a song the entire United States considers a heritage, was a festering wound in Ray Charles's heart. People loved it for its melody, for its haunting vocals, but few knew. Ray despised that song, despised it because it reminded him of the woman he couldn't keep, and a whole land that once rejected him simply because of the color of his skin, which he could not wash away. People believe Georgia refers to a state, and indeed, the song was adopted as Georgia's state song in 1979, but for Ray, Georgia was a real woman, not a fiction, not a metaphor. Someone who loved him fiercely, but also someone who got up and left when she saw him sinking deep into temptation. Georgia left not because Ray was blind, not because he was poor, but because he was gradually losing himself. That woman, no one knows how long they were truly together. There are no public photos, only the song, and a name, Georgia. He never confirmed it, but he never denied it either. Perhaps that was the only way he dared to keep her in music, not in real life. The irony is this very song made Ray a legend, but it also once made him swallow tears. In 1961, Ray refused to perform in Georgia, not because he was arrogant, but because people loved his music, applauded thunderously, yet wouldn't allow people like him to sit at the same table in a restaurant. Ray canceled the show and then was banned from performing in that state for nearly 20 years, a state that banned an artist because he dared to protest injustice. A hidden love that couldn't overcome the battles within the man himself. That wasn't love, that was tragedy. When the state of Georgia finally made Georgia on My Mind its official song, they called it an honor to Ray Charles. But who was truly honored? An artist banished from his homeland. A man who wrote about pain that the whole world sang as a celebratory anthem. They called it a victory. But for Ray, it was just a vicious cycle loved for his talent, but never accepted for who he was. Georgia wasn't just a song. It was a wound. It was an apology never forgiven. It was an embrace never given. It was tears hidden in alcohol on long tour nights. And the bitterest part, it was Ray's biggest hit, but it was a song he only sang when he had no other choice. On stage. People saw him close his eyes, tilt his head, smile faintly. But backstage, Ray once told a close friend, "Every time I sing that damn song, it's like bleeding in public." Ray's audience, many of whom had been hurt, had grown up feeling inadequate because of things they couldn't change: skin color, gender, circumstances. They found silent empathy in Ray's voice. And Georgia on My Mind became a national anthem not because it was joyful, but because everyone had lost something and couldn't express it. Ray Charles carried that song throughout his life, and then carried it even after he closed his eyes. People thought it was a love song, but in truth, it was the song Ray Charles sang for only one person, someone who had walked away and never returned. Ray once said, "If a place doesn't let you enter through the front door, then don't perform there." Yet the price for that self-respect was being erased from his own homeland. In 1961, as the white Cadillac rolled to the edge of Georgia, the driver stopped the car, turned and said, We're almost there. Get ready." Ray sat in the back, silent. His eyes were blind, but his mind had never been clearer. Outside, hundreds of spectators were waiting, both white and black, but backstage. The authorities had sent a very clear message. Black audiences were not allowed to sit in the same section as white audiences, and Ray was expected to stand on a stage in such a place. He chose to cancel the show. Not a grand political statement, simply "I will not sing in a place that does not treat people equally." But that simple act immediately made Ray a thorn in Georgia's side. They banned him from performing for nearly 2 decades thereafter, even though he had never made any public political statements, never incited crowds, never appeared on television as a spokesperson for any movement. An artist punished for refusing to sing before racially segregated seating. The cruelty here is Georgia wasn't just the place where the show was held. It was where Ray's earliest memories were formed. It was where he once sat listening to his mother sing by the window, the smell of sweat and dust filtering through the torn curtain. It was where he first touched a piano in a tiny wooden church under the slanting sunlight. Yet that place turned its back on him simply because he dared to maintain his self-respect. Ray didn't make a fuss. He didn't respond to the press. He never spoke ill of Georgia in any interview, but he never returned there, not once, on every tour. He avoided it as if avoiding an unhealed scar. No one forced him, but everyone knew why. It wasn't until 1979, nearly 20 years later, that the state of Georgia officially apologized. They held a solemn ceremony, presented him with an honorary medal, and declared "Georgia on My Mind" the official state song. People applauded. He smiled politely, but in his heart, Ray knew he didn't need their forgiveness. They were the ones who needed to ask for it. This story has never been fully told. No documents elaborate on it, because no one wants to revisit the fact that a U.S. state once punished an artist simply because he had the courage to walk away. No one wants to talk about that hard-to-swallow truth that Ray was punished not for rebellion, but for being too quiet, too steadfast. Today's audience. Many think of Ray as an icon, a legend, the man who overcame adversity. But the truth is, he didn't overcome anything. He simply lived authentically, spoke little, and never bowed his head. And that very unyielding spirit, at that time, was the most dangerous thing. Those who have lived through injustice will understand that it doesn't require speeches. It doesn't require violence. Sometimes it just takes standing up and walking off a stage, and then living a lifetime with the consequences of that decision. Ray Charles didn't need to speak loudly to make an impact. He just needed one step at the right time, in the right place, and that step, though no one heard his footsteps, resonated more powerfully than any speech in America at the time. Every time he stepped onto the stage, Ray Charles looked extraordinary, his small frame, eyes tightly shut, yet every note that emanated from his mouth was like fire. The crowd rose, applauding, cheering, but behind that spotlight was a weary man, his hands trembling as he lifted a glass of water, not because of age, but because of a silent battle, spanning decades and never truly ending. Ray once said, "Music saved me, but sometimes it wasn't enough." At such times, he sought a private remedy, a habit he started very early, when loneliness and pain were the only things he had left. He didn't use it for joy. He used it to forget the losses, the childhood falls, and the way people looked at him as if he were both pitiable and alien. From the early 1950s, Ray began to rely on it, not because he was an artist, but because he was human, a human who had helplessly witnessed his brother's death. A 7-year-old child gradually losing his sight without anyone being able to explain why. A man who emerged from poverty, living in a society filled with invisible barriers, where a voice could travel far but a person was always held back by prejudice. He tried to hide it. Even when success surrounded him, with millions of records sold and sold-out shows, he still carried small packages with him, like a habit, like a charm against internal collapse. And then in 1965 he was arrested. There was no other way. He entered a treatment center, something very few dared to do at that time, especially a celebrity like him. Ray succeeded, at least for a while. He overcame the darkest period, rising on his own strength without hiding, without blaming. But that victory was not entirely absolute, because pain, once it deeply embeds itself in the soul, easily finds a new form to return. Later, He continued to struggle with alcohol and other legal stimulants, no longer extreme but never completely shed. Ray never complained aloud. There were no tearful speeches, no blaming fate. He only left behind his music, the only thing that never lied. In every piano note he played, in every broken line he sang, one could feel something shattered, gently, but truly, like a man who had fallen to the very bottom and crawled back up, with only his bare hands. People remember Ray Charles for his voice, warm as whiskey, for his closed eyes that still saw music. But ultimately, an important part of him, the vulnerable, fragile, most human part, was the silent battle he lived with almost his entire life. A battle that not everyone saw, and perhaps that very silence is what made it hurt the most. Not everyone wishes to be named at their father's funeral, especially when their father is an icon. The memorial service for Ray Charles in 2004 was packed. Media lights flashed, and celebrities stepped up one by one to bid farewell. But there were a few faces in the crowd who stood silently at the back, unnamed, unintroduced. They were his children, at least some of them, and no one was sure how many there were. The official number of Ray's children was 12, but the story was never that clear. 10 different women, mostly unmarried, some never publicly acknowledged. Some children grew up only hearing their father on the radio. Some were once held by Ray as they slept, but woke up the next day to find he had left. A man with a voice that healed millions of hearts, yet left many of his own children growing up with a fracture in their souls. Not because he didn't love them. Relatives recounted that Ray would beam with joy when mentioning his children. But love and presence don't always go hand in hand. And for Ray, a man who spent most of his life on tour, in recording studios, or alone in hotel rooms, presence was almost a luxury. Each child grew up with a different story. Some received full financial support, living in mansions. Some received nothing, having to prove their paternity after his death. And then, when Ray passed away, all those scattered lives were forced to converge, not because of his musical legacy, but because of his will. In a move that surprised many, most of Ray's fortune, millions of dollars, was transferred to a charitable foundation he established before his death. A seemingly noble decision, but one that plunged the family into a vortex of disputes that have never fully closed. Some children received a small sum, the rest nothing. Some questioned signatures, some demanded additional testing, some just wanted to be recognized as his children, even if there was nothing left to inherit. The media at the time reported it as a backstage drama of a legendary singer, but for those involved, it was a real story, real pain. No one chooses their parents, and sometimes, a famous name can be the biggest wall between a child and the one who brought them into the world. Ray once said, "Music is the only language I speak fluently." Perhaps that's true, because for his children, many questions in their hearts were never answered with words. Only old musical fragments remained, faded photographs, and a bitter truth. Loving a famous father was never easy, especially when that person never truly belonged anywhere, not even in the hearts of those closest to them. By day, they were colleagues, dressed impeccably, speaking appropriately, exchanging brief glances before stepping onto the stage as professional artists. But after the show, in the backstage shadows, Marianne Fisher used to call Ray "my man," not Mr. Charles, not boss. It was "my man." And Ray, he just had to turn and look at her, saying nothing, just a slight nod, and she knew that night she wouldn't go home alone. But tragically, that love was never illuminated by the spotlight. The two were together for nearly 20 years. But no one in the audience or in Ray's official life was allowed to know Marianne as his woman. Just a backup singer, a shadow. Marianne was not an easily swayed woman. Before meeting Ray, she was already a formidable artist, singing blues even before people thought black women had a place in the industry. But when she joined Ray's band, she knew she was playing with fire, a beautiful fire, but one that burned very quickly. And when love began in a quiet dressing room, it also carried the signs of evasion from the start. Ray loved her. Everyone could see that. He wrote songs specifically for Marianne to sing, always giving her the longest gaze during every performance. But he never walked her through the backstage area as her man. Because he had a family, a wife, children, an image to maintain in a society already full of prejudice against people like him. Being a black artist was difficult enough. Being a promiscuous black artist was far more challenging. Marianne endured that for nearly 2 decades. There were nights Ray disappeared without a word. Days he appeared in magazines alongside his wife as if she didn't exist. She wasn't jealous, she was hurt. Because love is only real when one dares to acknowledge it. Not just when the door is closed. She once left him, walked away, vanished. Ray didn't hold her back. But then a few months later, she reappeared, standing behind him, singing backup as if she had never been angry. No one knew what drew her back. Perhaps longing. Perhaps the piano he played while she was gone. A few years before Ray passed, Marianne almost withdrew from music. She didn't speak about the relationship, didn't demand anything, didn't badmouth him. She lived as if that part of her life had never happened. But in a late-life interview, when asked about the man who made you sing with the most emotion, she simply smiled. He didn't just make me sing, he made me feel. Their story has no clear ending, no reunion, no wedding, no photos hung in a living room. Only a few old recordings where Marianne's voice resonates beneath Ray's melody, like a silent whisper between two people who loved each other but couldn't name each other in a life full of boundaries. Not everyone is brave enough to live that way. But Marianne was, and Ray, he was once my man, even if only in the shadows. There are losses that arrive slowly, gnawing away bit by bit, as if life deliberately accustoms people to a painful ending. Ray wasn't born without sight. Before the age of 7, the boy could still see his mother's face, could discern the green of the trees outside, and knew the shape of sunlight filtering through the window crack in the morning. That was a very different kind of loss, losing something you once possessed, and having no one to blame but fate. People often speak of Ray as a born-blind musical genius, as if his life began in darkness. But no, he once saw, and precisely because he once saw. The panic as his vision faded became truly terrifying. It didn't happen overnight, it gradually blurred, lines dissolving like a painting washed away in the rain. First, the letters smudged, then his mother's silhouette faded like smoke. And then one day, there was nothing left. Glaucoma, they called it, a common eye disease. But for a child growing up in a tiny, impoverished neighborhood in Florida, no one had the money or knowledge to understand what it was. His mother, Mrs. Aretha, once took him to doctors, but every answer was just a shake of the head. It won't heal. A harsh refusal, without explanation, without hope. And so the light quietly departed the 7-year-old boy's life, as silently as it came, without a word of farewell. That pain didn't need to be mentioned, for it was present in every note Ray played for the rest of his life. No one taught him to play. The boarding school for the visually impaired only gave him a few basic lessons, but most of the time, Ray learned by listening, straining to hear every melody, every riff, and finding his way on the keyboard like a blind person navigating a street. His hands were like eyes, unable to see but knowing exactly where each note lay. He played piano, saxophone, even clarinet, needing no sight, only feeling. Strangely, throughout his life, Ray rarely spoke about losing his sight, as if he didn't want anyone to pity him for it. Once, a journalist asked if he remembered his mother's face. Ray was silent for a long time, then uttered a remark that sounded like a joke but was deeply painful. "I do, but I try to forget, because remembering without being able to see again hurts far more." The truth is, he never truly forgot. Every melancholic song he wrote, every haunting blues melody carried the image of a child who once saw the world, then had to live the rest of his life in that memory. People called Ray a genius in the dark. But if you ask those close to him, they'd say Ray didn't live in darkness. He lived in the memory of light, and that was what left his heart perpetually empty. The sound of the church organ and the cries from a lover's bed for Ray Charles both shared a common rhythm, but it was precisely that fusion that made him a heretic in the eyes of those who raised him. Ray started in the church sweat-filled Sunday services, fervent applause, and gospel music echoing beneath cracked wooden beams. Every time young Ray was led to the stage, people fell silent. He couldn't see anyone, but he knew hundreds of eyes were on him. And when the music swelled, people wept, Not because he was blind, but because the music he brought made them believe in God more deeply, a God of sorrow, but also a God of hope. But then the boy grew up and grew up quickly in a very unwelcome way. When Ray transitioned from church music to rhythm and blues that was full of raw instinct and physicality, his entire community turned their backs. They didn't understand or didn't want to understand why the child raised on the Bible dared to use God's melodies to speak of desire. They called his music blasphemy in the blues. One preacher even declared, if Satan had a soundtrack, Ray Charles would write it. The pain lies in this: he never betrayed anyone. He simply didn't want to be confined. For Ray, church music and secular music were no different in spirit. Both were calls from deep within the human soul. He once said in a rare interview, "When I hear someone moan from losing their lover, I hear the exact same thing as when my mama prayed in desperation." Ray took harmonies from hymns, infused them into love songs. He adopted the church's vocal style, full of inflections, wailing, and then sang about carnal matters, about human yearning, and so he was ostracized. Those who once embraced young Ray now viewed him as an apostate. He was once expelled from a small auditorium in Alabama for daring to perform "I Got a Woman," a song the evangelists deemed filthy, because it transformed sacred words into a description of a woman pleasing a man. The irony is, it was precisely that combination that made Ray immortal. Without that blasphemous quality, there would be no music that tore at the souls of millions for decades. He was the first to turn gospel into a weapon, shattering the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between the church and the bar. He brought God down to earth, then breathed life into the suffering, the groans, even the suppressed desires. But that didn't stop him from being tormented. A part of him still belonged to the church. That old church in Florida, where his mother sat in the front pew every week. Ray didn't go back there, not because he hated it, but because he knew any return would only be a cut into his self-respect. He chose to stand from afar, playing the old chords again, but never apologizing for having grown. It was that very conflict between faith and instinct that made Ray always seem like a man of two faces. On one side, the child who believed in God. On the other, the artist who dared to desecrate the temple with his own voice. Some people shouted slogans, some raised their fists. As for Ray Charles, he simply and silently took out his wallet and was still resented. The world viewed him as an artist who avoided politics. They criticized him for not standing with Martin Luther King, for not appearing in the Selma marches. They whispered, "Ray only cares about money. He doesn't dare get involved in big issues." But those words only came from outsiders, people who didn't know that, behind the dark glasses and familiar piano. Ray was fighting in his own way, silently but more persistently than any declaration. He once privately paid bail for dozens of young black individuals arrested during protests in Birmingham. Not for recognition, but because he understood too well the feeling of standing before the gates of a system that refused to open, only wanting to crush. He protected children who barely understood the rules of discrimination before being thrown into police stations like criminals. And he didn't need anyone to know. No press conferences, no speeches. Ray quietly funded free lunches for black students in still segregated schools, places where their meals were always the leftovers, the cold portions, the stale ones. Not because he wanted to do charity, but because he had eaten like that, had been hungry like that. He knew well the feeling of an empty stomach, while people told him he wasn't trying hard enough. No one put him on the front page for it, nor did anyone erect a statue of him alongside civil rights activists. Ray understood and accepted that. "I don't need to shout to prove I'm doing what's right," he once murmured to his manager. For Ray, that very silence was the highest form of resistance. At a time when artists could be boycotted simply for speaking out, he chose to inject financial lifeblood into the movement so others could stand up, could shout on his behalf. But silence also has its price. Some called him a coward, some colleagues turned their backs, thinking he wasn't committed. One newspaper even wrote that Ray Charles lacked the courage to step out of his comfort zone. They didn't know or didn't want to know that Ray's comfort zone had never existed. As a blind black man, relying on his hearing and senses, he had to step out of safety at the age of 7, from the moment he lost his sight and his mother passed away. Even until his death, Ray never spoke about what he had done. His will contained no mention of his contributions, but his company's accounting records, known only to a few close associates, documented numerous unspecified purpose expenditures, from car rentals for students blocked from attending school to legal fees for families forced to relocate from old black neighborhoods. Ray Charles didn't need to stand on a podium to become an icon. He chose to stand in the shadows, not out of fear, but because he understood that true light doesn't come from the stage. It comes from doing the right thing without needing anyone's applause, and sometimes that was the rarest form of courage in his era. They called it a technical decision. But Ray knew perfectly well the reason wasn't in the sound. It was in the skin color. It was the mid-1960s. Ray had just received an invitation to perform live on national television, a major TV show that could elevate his status. The contract was signed, the filming schedule set, but just days before the performance, the call came. Brief, chilling. The program had to change guests due to audience considerations. In other words, because he was a black man, and American television at the time still wanted to keep the screen truly clean of non-white faces. His manager was furious. The whole band was outraged. But Ray was different. He didn't shout, he didn't pound the table, he simply nodded, then quietly called his lawyer. That TV station never imagined someone like Ray Charles, blind, uneducated, not well-spoken, would dare to sue, but he did, and he won. The story didn't make headlines. There were no press conferences. No, what did Ray say about this shocking incident? Because Ray said nothing at all. He demanded that everything remain confidential, even from the winning side. Not a single complaint, no self-congratulation. Even when someone casually asked him about it later, he'd just smile faintly. They just didn't like my haircut. Some said Ray was timid, but in truth, he was astute. He understood too well how the world operated, that when you're a successful black person, just one wrong half-sentence could ruin an entire career. Winning a lawsuit didn't mean winning against deep-seated discrimination, so Ray chose to fight without making a sound. What he needed wasn't fame, but legal precedent, and he created that precedent, silently but permanently. Many black artists who later appeared on air didn't know they stood on the shoulders of a lawsuit no one spoke of, but Ray didn't need them to know. He once whispered to a close friend in the band, "It's enough if the young ones don't have to receive rejection letters because of their skin color like I did." That incident alienated many TV stations. Some even banned his music for several years afterward, citing lack of suitability for general audiences. But he didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He didn't yield. He just kept touring, kept recording, kept opening doors for those like him through music and through actions no one heard. The world that once told him he was too black for TV now replays his old recordings on every major holiday. But Ray is no longer alive to witness that. Like so many silent battles he won without flowers, without an audience, he left everything behind. Not a line in his memoir, not a bitter word. Only those who truly understood him knew there are rebellions that don't need megaphones, don't need banners. They just need the courage to exist, to stand tall, even when the entire screen tries to ignore one's presence. Not in a hospital, not in a bed with tubes all over, but in the recording studio, where Ray Charles, with a body increasingly weakened by illness, still asked for microphone adjustments, told the engineer to push the piano up a bit, then turned to Norah Jones and smiled faintly, "Take it slow, baby." His final album, Genius Loves Company, was a cleverly disguised farewell wrapped in gentle duets, no clamor, no self-pity, and no one knew, except for a few close confidants, that he had signed papers diagnosing him with end-stage liver cancer during the album's production. Doctors made it clear the remaining time was not measured in years, but in months. Yet Ray didn't withdraw. He didn't go home to rest. He simply said, "Let me sing one more time, then I'll go." In the studio then, no one dared to cry, because if they cried, the recording would be ruined, and also because he wouldn't allow it. The atmosphere was sometimes stifling, not from musical pressure, but because the man sitting in the middle of that room, the aged father of R&B and soul, was struggling to keep his breath from breaking during the climax. Sometimes, his hands trembled as he played. One day, midway through a session, Ray vomited blood. They had to take him out, clean up. Then he came back and continued recording. No one dared to say anything, because he absolutely refused to cancel the schedule. Elton John once recounted, he sang as if he was trying to pour all his soul into those still living. And indeed, every track on Genius Loves Company was a farewell tearless, but piercing to the core. Some tracks like Sorry Seems to Be the Hardest Word or Heaven Help Us All. If you listen closely, you'll feel as if Ray is talking to himself or someone long departed. All the artists featured on the album, from Bonnie Raitt, Natalie Cole, to B.B. King, weren't sure if this would be their last recording with Ray. But in his eyes, in the way he shook each person's hand after every song, they sensed a quiet parting. And it was so. The album was completed just as Ray was admitted to the hospital. He passed away a few months later, without pomp, without a stage, without the grand funerals of many other celebrities. Only family, a few close friends, and soft music playing in the hospital room. Those were the very last recordings he left behind. When Genius Loves Company was released, no one thought it was his final musical testament. But then, the album won 8 Grammy Awards, and when accepting the award on his behalf, Ray's representative simply said, he knew he didn't have much time, but he chose to sing. He chose to sing instead of remaining silent. He chose to leave behind the sound of his piano instead of leaving regret. Not everyone is brave enough to transform the moment of their impending departure into a work of art. Ray Charles did, quietly, painfully, but as genuinely as he lived, and departed. Ray Charles didn't just leave behind music. He left behind fragments of a life, full of struggle, contradiction, love, and even quiet wounds that never fully healed. Behind the brilliance was a man who lived authentically, loved truly, and felt profound pain. Every melody he left was not just music, but a confession, a farewell, his final expression of love to the world. We cannot fully understand a person through a few biographical lines, but through these untold aspects, we see more clearly the deeply flawed greatness of Ray Charles, an imperfect genius, but utterly genuine. If this story resonated with something in your heart, please leave a like. Comment your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more profound and emotionally resonant real-life stories. Thank you for listening.